Today we're going to talk about some Berliner Weiss, and specifically a perspective on fermenting Berliner Weiss. Just the basics of Berliner Weiss, what is it? It's a light German wheat beer. Low alcohol, low original gravity, low final gravity. Alcohol around 3 to 3.5% by volume. And it's about 50-50 wheat. That ratio can shift a little bit. And really low BUs, around 5, maybe 5 to 8. And this color right here is really, really light colored beer. The big thing that sets it apart from other wheat beers is its acidity. It's really an acidic beer, really tart and sour. And so the pH of these beers can range between 3 and 3.3, unlike your normal final pH of a beer that might be around 4.2. Total acidity as lactic acid is in the range of about 0.6% to 0.8 or 6,000 to 8,000 ppm. So basically it's sour. That's the big message for this beer, it's sour. So I'm just gonna go through my personal history of brewing this beer. I had this beer about 11, 12 years ago, and it blew me away. It was a really interesting beer at the time. I don't think they even produce this beer anymore, and even towards the end of their production, it wasn't the same as it was 10 to 12 years ago. But this beer was like the one I was describing, super, super sour. Not just tart, but extremely sour. And so this beer became my target, kind of what I was trying to make over the years. So my first shot at it was about 10 years ago when I first started working at the lab. I decided I was going to try to brew a Berliner Weiss. And so I picked up this book, the German Wheat Beer book by Eric Wagner, and looked through it to see what kind of details there might be about making a beer like this. And through looking at the book, it gave recommendations on using about 4 to 6 parts yeast to 1 part Lactobacillus delbrueckii. And that's the big piece of the puzzle for making this beer. You're using some bacteria, specifically lactic acid bacteria, to sour it. And so looking at that information, 1 part bacteria to 4 to 6 parts yeast, and then the fermentation and aging was done at pretty cool temps, about 55 to 56. And so that's what I did. A little bit different on the cultures. I used Lactobacillus brevis, another lactic acid bacteria, and then 1007, which is a German ale yeast, and fermented at 56 and aged at 56. And after primary fermentation was complete, after about 2 weeks, I added to some bottles at bottling Lactobacillus, and to some bottles for fun, I just did some Brettanomyces additions. When I was done with this beer, and after a few months of aging, it didn't hit the mark at all. It wasn't sour enough. It was, you could call it tart, but it wasn't extremely acidic. I had a bunch of the bottles and had some German friends over one time, so I brought these out to see what they thought about them. And they also noted, it just wasn't sour enough. But the interesting thing was, these were kind of blind tests, so they didn't know what beers were what. And they picked out the bottles that had Brettanomyces in them as being spot on as far as the flavor goes. So I thought that was really interesting that they picked these out of all the others to have a consistent flavor with this style of beer. So a couple years later, times passed and I brewed other beers and put this on the back burner. Talked to my friend Alan Taylor, who I worked with at Full Sail Brewing for a while. And he's a German brewmaster, speaks German. His wife's German, so he's basically a German. And he likes this beer too. This is one of his favorite beers, and specifically that same brand. And he had the opportunity to interview a German brewmaster from a Berliner Weiss brewery. And so I thought, well, this would be great. He'll get the perspective on how to brew this beer. And so we took his notes and developed some test brews to do. And one of the big differences between this guy's notes and the book I'd previously read was the bacteria to yeast ratio. It was basically the reverse. What was recommended was 5 parts Lactobacillus to 1 part yeast. And in these trials, we used a different strain, a Lactobacillus buchneri strain, which is a strain that was isolated from a Berliner Weiss beer. And then the temperatures were a little different than recommended. We ran higher fermentation temperatures on these tests. And then also we incorporated the Brettanomyces, because this was part of his information that they did utilize Brettanomyces in these beers. And so we ran a bunch of 3-barrel brews and splitting them up into different fermenters, a lot of different blends of yeast, or just ratios, blends, times of inoculation. And the result was we were getting closer, but it still wasn't there. We're still having a really hard time getting the lactic acid, the really acidic character that this beer had. And also the yeast strain that we're using an American ale yeast strain because we thought it'd work out being a clean yeast strain, but it didn't. It really had a weird flavor profile in this beer. And we did these tests over about a year and kind of got frustrated with it because we had all the lowdown from the brewmaster, all the specs, and we still couldn't make this beer for some reason. So, my question was, well, what should we try now? I just going to give up on it, or kind of try to break it down and to figure out how to do it. And so that's when I took it from doing these larger batches down to a lab scale. So kind of removing the flavor aspect of it and just, using a pH meter and using small lab scale fermentations. How do I make a really sour beer really fast? And so, the questions asked were how do we get acid in beers? And one source is yeast. Yeast produces acid during fermentation. And then obviously Lactobacillus produces acid. And so with the yeast, I thought, well, let's figure out what the best strain is. Let's look at a bunch of different yeast strains and see if there's maybe a yeast that'll fit the bill. And then with the Lactobacillus, how much do we need? We have different numbers from different people. How much do we really need? And then how do we pitch it? Do we pitch it with the Saccharomyces, or maybe we pitch it before the Saccharomyces? So choosing the yeast, what I did at the lab was just look through pH data on our propagation. So I looked at our prop information and looked at which strains drop the pH the most during growth. And I came up with about 10, the top 10 acid producers. And then weeded through these and threw out the ones that obviously wouldn't have the right flavor profile, like Belgian wheat strains or any German wheat beer strains. Those were tossed out. And after doing all that, I had 2 strains left. And those were 1007, which is a German ale yeast. And that makes sense. Those are kind of the type of strain you'd use for this German wheat beer. And then the 2124, which is a German lager yeast, which isn't necessarily as intuitive of a choice, but it is a good strain. When you're using it at warmer temperatures, it does stay cleaner than other lagers. So I thought those were a couple interesting strains, so decided to run a couple quick tests on these. So the way I ran these tests for the Saccharomyces was doing mini fermentations. And in the tests, I'd run the yeast at 3 million cell per mil pitch rates, and also used this yeast with Lactobacillus and ran the Lactobacillus at 15 million cells per mil. So that was kind of holding on to that 1 part yeast to 5 parts Lactobacillus ratio. And so these mini fermentation tests are 15 mils of wort, and it's an 8-degree Plato, just plain old Pilsen Light DME wort, no hops, and then run at 20C. And then we'd check pH and gravity on these things, and we do destructive sampling. So we'd take 3 tubes at a time, test all 3, and then dump them because we're stealing so much liquid from them to test them. And we test it at day 0, 1, and 5. And this is the device we use to check the gravity. It's just a handheld digital density meter. So it allows us to take densities on really small samples. And so this is the graph of the fermentation. Nothing too exciting, but the 1007 in the blue, drops down to roughly 4.2, which is kind of normal for fermentation like that. And then the 2124 dropped a little bit lower, had a little bit higher acid production, and it also fermented just a little bit quicker. It looks somewhat significant in the graph, the difference between the two, but basically they're ending at a similar pH, 4.1 to 4.0. The other test was the Saccharomyces with Lactobacillus. So these were the fermentations where we had yeast and lactic acid bacteria. And these were a little bit different. You can see the 1007 with the Lactobacillus dropped pH faster and went to a lower level. And then the 2124 with Lactobacillus pH didn't drop as quickly and kind of leveled off at a higher pH and somewhat of a significantly higher pH. And so when I looked at this data, I had to think about what was true. Is 1007 a way higher acid producer and does it work better with lactic acid bacteria? Or in these tests, was 2124 just fermenting a little quicker and therefore inhibiting the lactobacillus and not allowing it to grow and produce the acid? And I think the latter is what happened looking at the Saccharomyces only data. But looking at these two tests, it basically told me that both these strains can handle working with lactobacillus, that the pHs were dropping low, and one of them wasn't inhibited by acid production. Because of the historical use of 1007, I decided to pick that strain to work with for the future trials. So we picked our Saccharomyces strain. The next part was to figure out how much lactobacillus to use. And so again, we did these many tube fermentations, and we ran lactobacillus at 15 million cells per mil, 5 million, and 1 million cells per mil. Same wort, same tubes, same temperature, and then we checked pH and gravity, and we threw in a couple more days of testing, so at 0, 1, 2, 3, and 7 days. And these are the results of this test, pH drop over time. So in the blue, you have the 15 million cells per mil pitch rate, and then red, 5 million, and green, 1 million cells per mil. And if you kind of break up the graph a little bit, this is the first 48 hours. This is probably the most important part to me. You can see that the 5 and 15 were similar drops. They're dropping the pH pretty quick, down to almost to the mid 3s in 48 hours. And the 1 million cell per mil was kind of catching up to that point, but the big thing is there was a longer lag with that 1 million cell per mil pitch rate. And when I look at that makes me concerned when the wort's sitting at a higher gravity for a longer amount of time. The quick pH drop protects the wort from other bugs that are going to possibly start fermenting your wort due to, I wouldn't say poor sanitation, but just the fact that there's probably going to be a small amount of infection and a lot of warts. And then the end of the graph, the last part of it, you can see the 5 and 15 are pretty close to each other. They're dropping to the low 3s. And the 1 million finally catches up at the end, gets down there pretty low in the low 3s also. But one thing to look at is the 1 million cell per mil pitch rate takes about 2 days longer to hit 3.35 than the 15 million cell per mil. So it takes way longer to get that wort into a kind of a safe zone. Because during a lactobacillus fermentation, you're not losing a lot of the sugars. It uses a small amount of sugar to produce a lot of acid. So you still have a lot of food for other microorganisms in there. So it's, like I said before, the pH drop, a quick pH drop is pretty important. Okay, so the conclusions of this section of the test was that 1 million cells per mil pretty much doesn't sour the beer fast or sour the wort quick enough. 5 and 15, pretty comparable. My preference is to sour it as fast as you can, but I think 15 was a little overkill. It wasn't necessary to use that much. So I just kind of split the difference using 10 million cells per mil, and that will be the pitch rate I use for the rest of the test. And this quantity or this pitch rate's somewhat consistent with previous recommendations that we had on this type of fermentation. All right, so kind of the last piece of the puzzle is how do we pitch the yeast and bacteria? Should we pitch the lactobacillus and the German ale yeast together, or should we pitch the lactobacillus first and then pitch the Saccharomyces? And to check this out, we did a little bit different fermentation tests. We increased the volume to 150 mils and did these small flask fermentations. And this was due to the fact that we needed a little bit more volume so we could run some total acidity analysis on it. Because during these tests that we ran, we would check pH. And when you're getting in the range of, let's say, 3.1 to 3.3, that difference doesn't seem very significant, but in that range, there's a lot of potential for, I guess, different total acidity levels. And so if you run total acidity tests as lactic acid analysis, then you can really see a better picture of how sour that beer is. So these are a picture of the flask. It's 150 mils of wort, just like the previous worts that we used, the 8 Plato wort. We did the fermentations again at 20C, and we used 3 million cell per mil of 1007, and then we used 10 million cells of the 5335 Lactobacillus. And then at day 7, we check total acidity. So that was the only analysis we ran, was this at day 7, check total acidity, except for one trial, which goes for 14 days. And this is the layout of the test. So we have the Saccharomyces strain, 1007 for a 7-day fermentation, and then we take it, filter it, and test the total acidity. And then the next flask, the last Lactobacillus for 7 days, and again, filter, check acidity. And then we have the co-inoculation with the 2, ferment, check acidity. And then the last one is a little different. We ran the 5335, the Lactobacillus for 7 days. And then at day 7, we added the Saccharomyces to it and ran for 7 more days and checked the total acidity. So these are the results from that test. You have the 1007 in green, and obviously that's going to be the lowest total acidity. And then the Lactobacillus by itself is way up there, almost approaching the appropriate levels for this type of beer by itself at about 0.5%. And then the interesting one, and I think we could have predicted this, that the Lactobacillus and the Saccharomyces was actually at a lower level of acidity. And then you have the Lactobacillus, then Saccharomyces at 0.7, roughly 0.7%. And that's in the range of where we want to be for this style of beer. So from that information, we basically, we can see that, again, pitching the yeast with the Lactobacillus inhibits that acid production because, contrary to what we might think about Lactobacillus, it's not an extremely aggressive microorganism. It works kind of slow, whereas yeast goes crazy and eats up all the sugars. And when it does that, there's nothing left for the Lactobacillus to eat. So we know that that's going on. And pitching 5335, the Lactobacillus, is way better acid production than co-inoculation. But then we still need to deal with the remaining sugars. It only uses maybe 1 to 2 degree Plato worth of the sugar, so there's a bunch of sugar left in there. And then we see pitching separately, the Lactobacillus, then the Saccharomyces gives us the maximum acid production. Okay, and then part of the puzzle, another piece that we needed to look at, and this is something I haven't done a ton of practical tests on, is the Brettanomyces. And based on other tests that we've done with Brettanomyces and bottle conditioning with Brettanomyces, what I recommend for this style of beer is using about 1 million cells per mil at bottling. And the Lambicus strain is a good one for this style. It matches the flavor profile that this beer would have. Low pitch rates, and you get flavor development within 1 to 3 months, but kind of peaks probably around 6 months. But you don't want to pitch too much Brettanomyces because that's going to really overpower the beer pretty quick. So conclusions from this whole test and brewing or fermenting this type of beer. Lactobacillus at 10 million cells per mil is a good pitch rate. You're going to get super fast souring, and it's going to protect that wort from any other bugs. Pitch Lactobacillus, then the yeast. One note for getting 10 million cells per mil of lacto in a 5-gallon batch is you need about a 1 liter starter of Lactobacillus. So whatever your source may be for the Lactobacillus, you'll want to propagate that up to a liter quantity to get a 10 million cell per mil pitch rate. And you can propagate that bacteria in a really basic media. It's just, like, let's say 5 Plato wort with DME, no hops, and 5 to 7 days at a little warmer than room temp will get you there. 90 Fahrenheit's kind of the optimum for this strain of Lactobacillus, but it'll still grow well at 70 to 80. And then a big one is keep the BUs down. Don't overdo it with the hops and underdo it with the hops, because the hops will inhibit a lot of lactic acid bacteria. And so if you add too much hops when you're using this strain specifically, you won't get any acid production at all. Try some Brett in the bottles. And the 1007 strain works really well for this type of beer, but I think 2124 would be an interesting one to use too. And